Hello Mishpacha, it's Courtney, America's Jewish mother, and I am back with a Friday Reads video. So I know I skipped last week to do Friday Reads, and the reason why is because I was furiously doing course prep for our classes, which started back this week, and it's been really busy. So my reading has taken a nosedive. But anyway, in the 2-week period since I last did a Friday Reads video, I have finished 4 books. Yeah, that's right. I finished 4 books, and I DNF'd a book, so I would like to share those with you. So the first book that I finished is one that I mentioned in my Friday Reads video of 2 weeks ago, which was Iola Leroy by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And I was reading this because I am currently teaching it in one of my courses. And yeah, they read the first half of it for this week, and they're in the middle of doing discussions and things like that. This is an online class, by the way. So yeah, I ended up giving this book 2.75 stars, because here's the thing, excuse me, this is a novel that you should really reread for its read for its historical value and relevance more than for its actual plot line. So it centers around the title character, Iola Leroy, who is a very, very, very light-skinned, she basically looks white. I mean, I don't even know why I'm calling her very, very, very light-skinned African-American. She has African-American ancestry, but she basically looks white. And she grows up thinking that she is white until her father passes away, and then her father actually is white, and her mother is the one who has the African-American ancestry, and then his unscrupulous cousin, who was totally against his cousin being married to a woman who has any African-American blood, regardless of whether she looks white or not, then proceeds to disinherit both the cousin's wife and children, and Iola is one of the children, and then enslave them because they have African ancestry. So then Iola is enslaved, and then the story actually starts during the Civil War, and I think it takes place in some town in North Carolina, maybe, that Union soldiers take over, and then she gets released, and then she starts work as a nurse. So anyway, the story centers around her, but it also centers around these other characters, including some of her family members and her brother Harry, and their mother, and an uncle that they magically come across. And if this all sounds a bit disjointed, it's because the story itself is a bit disjointed, and it's told in a very episodic manner. It almost reads like, well, one of my students drew a comparison between this book and Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, and I kind of see why she drew that comparison, because like that sort of narrative nonfiction, this book is also very episodic in structure. So anyway, but I ended up giving this 2.75 stars because it does not really work as a story by 20th and 21st century standards. Now, I kind of feel like we should cut Frances Ellen Watkins Harper some slack here, because she was, in fact, one of the pioneers of the African-American novel. This was not the first African-American novel published. The first one that I'm aware of was William Wells Brown's novel Clotel, which came out in 1853, and this was published in 1892. So it had some predecessors, but only a handful. So it's not like Harper was drawing on a rich, vivid tradition of novels in the African-American literary tradition at this point. She was literally pioneering the genre. So I feel like we should sort of cut her some slack. But yeah, the characters are very flat. Iola Leroy is basically a saint. She pretty much stays a saint the whole way through. The only time she experiences any sort of character growth or change is after she learns that she is not, in fact, completely white, as she had thought, and she has some African-American ancestry, and that's really the only way in which her character grows at all. She goes from being like, yeah, slavery's not so bad, to, oh my god, this is terrible. Surprise, right? So that's really the only, I feel like, character growth that anyone experiences, and that happens relatively early on anyway. So yeah, the characters are pretty flat. Some people, when their names come up, you're like, wait, who was that again? They're pretty much interchangeable with one another after a certain point. And the only one who I feel like had any sort of authentic personality was this character, Aunt Linda, who was, very like straightforward and plain spoken, and she was gonna call him like she saw him, and that I kind of found refreshing. But she was really the only character. So if you read this book, I would read it for its historical value and not necessarily its literary value. So that was Iola Leroy. I do, however, think this is going to spark good conversation among my students, and has in fact already, so yay. The next book I finished was the Big Jewish Book for Jews by, who wrote this? Ellis, Weiner, and Barbara Davilman. So I ended up giving this 3.25 stars. So I liked this. I found it light and comic, which was its intended purpose. I feel like it's a good blend of humor and also some information about Judaism. So I feel like this book really sort of belongs in the edutainment genre. I do, however, think that you're not gonna find it all that funny if you're not already somewhat familiar with Jewish culture, because the book does rely on a lot of stereotypes to make its jokes and to convey its humor. So for that reason, I'm giving it 3.25 stars rather than a higher reading where I would sort of like unqualified, give it an unqualified recommendation. So yeah, 3.25 stars. It was light, it was comic. That's what I wanted for my light and August reading. The next book, I don't have the next book I finished. The next book I finished was The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett, which I read for Lindsay's virtual book club. This was our August pick. I quite liked this book. I ended up giving it 3.75 stars. Not quite a 4-star read for me, but pretty close. So this book centers around two very light-skinned African-American sisters who grow up in a small town in Louisiana where pretty much everyone is light-skinned African-American. And the community is very insular. And then when they are 16, these two sisters who are twins, one is named Stella and the other one's named Desiree, decide to run off to New Orleans. And from there, their lives sort of take these divergent paths where, oh shoot, now I'm going to forget which sister was which. Okay, I think Stella's the one who decides to pass as white and then basically lives out the rest of her days as a white woman and leaves Desiree and the family behind, never to be seen or heard from again. Although not totally. But and then Desiree runs off and marries this very, very dark-skinned African-American man, and then has a daughter by him who's also very dark, and ends up going back to their hometown and pretty much living out her days there. And so the story follows, you see it from both sisters' perspective, what happens to them, and then we see the next generation in what happens to both of their daughters and how their lives sort of intertwine again after a while. So yeah, I really liked this. I think it does a good job at exploring identity and freedom and how we craft our own identity for ourselves and what we sacrifice in the process and why we would choose to make those sacrifices. So yeah, I liked this overall. Again, it was not quite a 4-star read for me, but I would definitely still recommend it. I thought it was engaging and an interesting read. I certainly think it will provoke good book club discussion. So again, that was The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett, 3.75 stars. Then I finished Tipit by Maggie Griffin, the late mother of comedian Kathy Griffin. So this is basically just a short little humorous book where Maggie tells some stories from her life and gives you her, nonagenarian, wine drinking, Bill O'Reilly loving, tell it like it is, you know, ideas about the world around her. And surprisingly, for someone who was around age 90 when she wrote this and grew up in a Catholic family, you know, fairly conservative, she kind of has surprisingly progressive views on feminism and gay rights, so that was cool. But yeah, I really liked this. I laughed out loud multiple times while I was reading this. I also found it at some points very poignant and moving. And again, it was a really good pick for my light in August reading because it was light, and I appreciated that about it. Now, I will say that even though I ended up giving this 3.5 stars, which means I liked it and I would recommend it, I do have to recommend it with the reservation that I don't think you will really get much out of this if you are not already familiar with Kathy Griffin's comedy and you don't know who her mother is. Like, so if you hear this title, Tipit, which is Maggie's slogan, and you know what that means without me having to explain it to you, then by all means, read this book. You would probably enjoy it. But if not, then you're probably not really going to get that much out of it. But I liked it. I enjoyed it. So 3.5 stars. Okay. So on to the book I DNF'd, and I'm really sorry, Robert. I DNF'd Paris Trout by Pete Dexter, which is the first book that we had picked for the Barter Hordes book club for August. And so I read 125 pages of this, and so I DNF'd it around 40%, and there was just a lot of what I felt like was gratuitous violence against women. There's violence against this girl that happens in the very first part of the book. In the third part of the book, which that's the part that after I finished it, I DNF'd it, we see sort of violence that happens against Paris Trout's wife, Hannah, and it was just, I mean, it was a lot. So I just thought, I really don't want to read almost 200 more pages if there's just going to be more stuff like this. And I kind of felt like, based on where the story was going, there was, at least for me, not going to be enough payoff to continue reading if it was just going to be a lot of violence and violence and violence against women. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. I just started my fall semester back. It's a very stressful time. If I want to be depressed, I'll just go read the news headlines. So yeah, sorry, Robert. So I DNF'd this, and I know some people did finish it and found it, you know, quite readable and engaging. And I don't think the writing itself is bad, although personally I like a book to delve more deeply into the characters' minds and thoughts and feelings than I feel like this did. But yeah, I really kind of didn't say what this was about. I was just like, boom, here's why I didn't like this. Alright, so this book is about this title character, Paris Trout, who this takes place in sort of post-World War II, small town, Georgia, in a town called Cotton Point. And at the beginning of the book, Paris Trout is like a prominent citizen of this town because he owns this store that I guess makes pretty good money, and then he's sort of like I think Heidi at My Reading Life described him as a loan shark on the side, and I think that's a pretty apt description, so I'm gonna steal that terminology from Heidi. So yeah, he's kind of a loan shark on the side, and so near the beginning of the book, he sells a car to this young African-American man who promptly gets into an accident, and then he takes the car back to Paris and says, you know, I paid for insurance on this car, and Paris, who basically had just added the insurance to be like, how can I bilk more money out of this kid? Was like, it's not that kind of insurance. And so the kid basically was like, well, I'm not paying for this. And Paris is like, oh, you're going to pay for it. And so then later he goes to the kid's house, and there's this shootout, and he ends up killing the kid's mother and this 14-year-old girl who's staying with them. For really no reason at all. Like, they're in no way connected to the deal that he made with this, like, 16, 17-year-old kid, Henry Ray. They're in no way connected to this. So So I'm not even really sure why he killed them. That part didn't really make a lot of sense. But yeah, so it's about that. This is basically about that and about the fallout after that occurs. So yeah, that's what it's about. Again, I think other people have thought this book was, you know, pretty engaging and readable. But again, for me, I just felt like there was too much violence that seemed gratuitous, and I mean, I could be wrong because I didn't finish it, but I just did not feel like there was going to be a worthwhile payoff for me slogging through another, you know, 175 plus pages of this book with more gratuitous violence. So yeah, I didn't have this one. Okay, so on to what I'm currently reading. So I am within 100 pages. I'm a little less than 100 pages away from finishing Absalom by William Faulkner. This has been a very slow going read for me because it's very dense and the writing is beautiful, but the sentences are super long and the story is complicated and it's very difficult to parse out what exactly is going on, and so it requires a lot of concentration, and I really can't read more than about 15 to 25 pages of this at one time, so it's been pretty slow going, but I am right now halfway through chapter 7. I intend to finish chapter 7 today, then I will just have 2 chapters remaining, which I would like to finish within the next week, which seems totally doable. So that is Absalom. I also today started Swish My Quest to Become the Gayest Person Ever by Derfner. I felt like after all of the violence that I read about in Paris Trout, I would sort of, you know, I would pick one of my last Light in August readings for this, right? So it's basically kind of this guy, Joel's random thoughts on a variety of subjects. So he kind of started out this book with the idea of, I'm going to talk about how I'm the gayest person ever, and I'm going to write about all this casual sex I had, and blah, blah, blah. But as he writes in the introduction, with every topic that he started talking about, like knitting or casual sex, he would realize that it actually had connections to other topics and events in his life, and all of this was sort of helping him try to figure out who he was as a person. So I'm only 1 chapter into this so far, but I've found it quite funny so far, and I've also found it poignant at points. So I like a combination of funny and poignant, so this is good so far. And then tomorrow I'm going to have to start, I haven't started it yet, but tomorrow I'm going to have to start Bread Givers by Anzia Yezierska because my students in my Multicultural American Lit class are reading this, like first half of this next week. And I have read this before, but it's been a number of years, so I'm going to reread it, and if I go ahead and start it tomorrow, by like Wednesday, I should have gotten through all the reading that they're supposed to have gotten through by next Saturday, so I'll at least be on track with that. This is a partially autobiographical story that was published in the 1920s. Anzia Yezierska was a Jewish Polish immigrant to the United States, and this is about her. It's sort of, like I said, the most autobiographical of her work. So it's about a Jewish family that moves to the Lower East Side, and there's a father, a mother, and 4 daughters. And the father is this religious scholar, which in Orthodox Judaism is probably one of the highest things you could possibly do, but he needs to be financially supported by the mother and the 4 daughters. And because this is the 1920s, I mean, honestly, even today the values would clash, but because it's that time period, these new world values are definitely clashing with old world values, and the father tries to marry all of his daughters off to wealthy men who can help support him financially, and that doesn't work out. And I think the main character and narrator in here is the youngest daughter, and she's totally resentful, and the more she sees her father doing this, the more alienated she becomes from him. So that's basically what this is about, and like I said, it's pretty heavily based on Anzia Yezierska's own life. So yeah, that's Bread Givers. So that's what I have read, or DNF'd, or am reading, or in the case of Bread Givers, I'm going to read. So I would love to hear what y'all have been reading and enjoying lately. Please feel free to leave me a comment about that or any of the books that I mentioned down in the comments below. Also, I'm way behind on my booktube videos. I think my watch later list is at like 35 videos or something, which is unprecedented for me, honestly. I mean, I know some people's is in the hundreds, but for me, like, to have 35 videos that I need to watch is a lot. So if I usually watch your videos and comment on them and I have not done that lately, I'm gonna get to it. So I just, like I said, I've been really overwhelmed with beginning of school and all of that kind of stuff, so I'm sure it's gonna settle down here before too much longer. But yeah, so anyway, I hope y'all are doing well. I hope you're staying healthy. I hope you're doing good reading. And until next time, would it kill you to call your mother?